Welcome to Design and Dialogue, Jing Liu and Florian Idenburg. It's great to have you here from Soil Architects. I just have a couple of announcements for the audience first. First of all, if you just let us know where you are zooming in from, we always like to know that. If you have questions for Florian and Jing, put them in the chat box and we'll pick them up at the end of the conversation. And finally, we will be muting everyone just to ensure the audio quality is good. So don't be alarmed if you say something and we don't hear you. Okay, so thanks for joining us out there in the audience. And of course, it's so great to have you here to talk about the work of soil architects, soil architects. I think what we might do, if you're okay with it, is actually jump right into the images because we have so many great ones to show, beginning with a rather nice portrait of the two of you. So can you talk first a little bit about the studio and its history, when it was formed, how big is it now, and a little bit about the origin of your partnership?
Sure. I will start with that because that's an easy question. Yes, so Florian is born in Holland and I was born in China. And we both ended up in Japan in the 90s, and both for work and studies. And that's where we initially met at the office of Sana, Kazuyo Sejima, and Nuya Ishizawa's collaboration. And I think Florian was there en route, well, coming from Netherlands, and I was there from China, but then we both were also en route to New York, and I think that was the project of the new museum and the Toledo Art Museum. The glass pavilion was the project that brought Florian to the United States, and for me, it was the study and also the internships and the early career as an architect that brought me to the United States. So we kind of grew up in a very different context, in a very different time, the 70s and 80s.
Really? The 90s?
No, I'm just saying that 70s and 80s in Europe and China is a very different context, but somehow the two trajectory merged in the 90s in Japan, and then also from the early 2000s, we both ended up in the US. So that's when the kind of two paths converged. And we started our office in 2008. It was the Depression, as you know, the last big stock market crash. And we were both working for other offices at that time, but it was kind of a very intuitive, decisive moment that we thought, if this is at the bottom and we cannot get work anyways, and exciting work anyways, it's a time to reset and really think about what we want to do for the next, not year, but the next 10 years, next 20 years. It seemed like the right moment to start something new. And then that's when we started our office in 2008. And luckily, we were quite busy from the beginning. We did a lot of temporary pavilions and installations for New York organizations and also international organizations, institutions in the beginning. And that was a really good platform for us to really sharpen our keys or knives. In the beginning, to explore what do we want to do and what do we want to say as creatives. And like I said, we had an intuition that we didn't want to do things the way it was done before. And given the history at that moment, it felt the right thing to explore new aesthetics and the new orientation. And to have those very quick to be materialized works and smaller scale works was very, very productive for us in the beginning. And that's actually the type of work that we still carry on today, because we believe that that form of working, the very nimble and very kind of quick fire way of working, is very good and very tangible, substantial material way to work through ideas. So along with some of the bigger projects that we're also taking on, unfortunately, at this moment in our career, we're still always taking on the one or two every year, very quick, temporary and experimental projects.
Yeah, you know, it's great to hear the story about starting the studio practice right in the midst of that recession, because of course we're now at another very difficult moment for everybody, but also for architects. And I hope that some young practitioners out there are hearing that and thinking about how maybe some energy could come out of the current moment. So here's this fantastic picture of Brooklyn where your studio is based. Can you say a little bit about the scale of the studio now? How many people you have working with you? And I know it's a very international group as well.
Yeah, I would say certainly the pandemic has affected somewhat of our operation, but pre-pandemic, so we have a space which you see here at the end of the arrow, which is on Livingston Street in a rapidly changing Brooklyn where tall towers are going up all around us. And so we're on the second floor of a commercial building, and basically we have the entire floor. It's a 2-story building. Hopefully it won't turn into a tower anytime soon. But so we have 30 desks there, and we were pretty full before the pandemic, but now we have actually been reduced quite a bit because a lot of work is stopped or people moved to different places and are working from there. So the space can hold 30. Currently we're about 18 people. And but they're not all in New York, and they're not all in the office. So it's interesting to sort of, we are really actually rethinking also what the role of the office will be as we work in a more hybrid fashion.
Yeah, now we'll just start working through the images of the studio and some of the projects. But as we can see here, 12 languages spoken in the studio. And of course you come from, as Jing said, such different places originally.
I think Jing accounts for 5 of those languages. So,
but it seems to me like you are, in a funny way, a kind of specimen of what's happening to design and architecture practice, where it almost needs to be founded on this very international, global stage. And it's very interesting to me that you have that capacity sort of built into the studio, hardwired into the studio.
No, and I think there is also where New York for us is a very important place. This is where we started because it is actually a place in which we can all sort of be equally foreign, if you want. And the creative energy that comes from bringing people together from different cultural backgrounds is certainly what New York is known for. And so actually there was only sort of one place, I think, on the planet that made sense for us to start, which is right here. And I think that attracts a certain type of people, a certain type of creatives. And those are people who are attracted to work with us in the office. So I think this idea of people who don't really look at national borders as thresholds that they are too afraid to cross. I think for us, that was always very much part of the DNA of the practice. And luckily, it allowed us also to work very naturally around all these different places. So as Jing mentioned, we started in the middle of the crisis, but we weren't thinking that we were just limiting ourselves to the locale that we were in. And that really gave us an opportunity to work very openly in very different places. So you see the projects that are coming by, they're very, they are in Beijing, they are, in New York, they're in different places around the world. And I think that flexibility helped us very much in the beginning also build up sort of a portfolio.
Jing, can I ask you to expand a little bit on something you mentioned earlier, which is the connection to Sana, the great Japanese-based architectural firm. And you mentioned that the new museum and the stunning glass pavilion in Toledo were happening when you were associated with Sana. And I wonder whether you also would say that your approach to architecture and structure is to some degree a development of the experiences at Sana.
Yeah, I think the 2 great projects of Sana, the new museum and the pavilion in Toledo, were all Florian's projects, so I wouldn't take credit for that. I did work on the Toledo museum in the very beginning for a very, very short period of time. But indeed, I think the reason that I was attracted to Sana, maybe slightly different from Florian, but it both was very intentional. We really wanted to work for that office. We sought, made many phone calls and pulled many streets to just be there, and that really marked that it was a very important practice at that moment in the architecture discipline. I think there was something really fresh that came out of that period from that office that was not to talk, was kind of really looking at the time, it's in a different way. I mean, Japan always had a metabolism, so the idea of time and the architecture not as a static thing, but it's more of a evolving and growing and transforming thing. Objects and the process has always been in that kind of lineage of architecture thinking. But I think what Sana introduced was also a sense of lightness, a sense of irreverence to that kind of a new language, to that lineage of thinking, which is very different from, I guess, at that moment, the Dutch architecture was also very experimental, and was OMA coming out of that, and there was a lot of urban scale experimentations. But I think there was something very, very different that was happening in Tokyo. And I was also personally quite struck by the fact that it was a women-led office, and made it such a, marked such an important approach in architecture that was never previously seen. I think for me it was very interesting to just see it, personally up close and how it's done. And she seemed to be not even, Sejima seems to be not even aware of, or well, she's definitely very aware of, but she doesn't talk about it. She doesn't talk about it. She doesn't even make it into an issue, what it means to practice as a woman. But the result clearly has a very fresh and a new approach to the object as an architecture.
Right.
Yeah.
I realize we just got into an image that probably requires some explanation, so I'll just pause here. And so, Florian, can you tell us what we're looking at right now?
Well, so the two slides you saw before were the finished installation, but recently, actually right in the middle of COVID, we finished this transformation of the MAT Museum in Lisbon. This is a new museum that opened about 4 years ago, designed by Amanda Levette. And since the middle of last year, there's a new director, Beatriz Leanza, who actually came from Beijing and lived in Beijing for many years and helped set up the design week there, for instance. And so she came in and she wanted to transform the museum from a place to display art to really something that is much more programming centric and much more invites people in from the different communities. And so what we did is we built this installation, which you see here currently under construction, which is a place for projection, for workshops, for gatherings, performances, and we created a new entrance. So that was the image before, towards the city. So I don't know if people have been, some people might have been to the museum. It's very much oriented towards the river and towards the bay, but it sort of turns it back onto the city. And this is a very symbolic gesture in some way to invite the city in, invite the citizens in, to make it much more a forum and a place for discourse rather than just a big room to display art. And so we worked with a local fabricator, Artworks, and as you see on the next slides, I think what we try to do here, it's a temporary installation, but certainly some of the materials that we work with, the fabrics, the textures, the fiber grading, are all elements we put together here. And so this was all built during COVID. And now it's functioning, it's open. It opened actually in June, so they had a shutdown there a little bit for a while, but it was really interesting to work through sort of this transformation of this institution during this period. And I think what was also quite interesting is that the museum so concurrently redefined their digital identity. And I think what they did very strongly is make sort of this integrated digital and physical infrastructure for this new type of public institution.
That might actually be a good moment to ask you about the name of the studio, SOIL, and then this other term, solid objectives, that you use. Can you just explain the nomenclature of the practice? Because it seems to me it relates precisely to that question of the experiential and the digital, but then also the physical and the...
Yeah, I think we are very much an office that lives a digital life, so to say, but is not interested in necessarily literally representing that digital culture, but in some way, a lot of our work could have not been created without a sort of a very strong digital awareness. So a lot of it has to do with how do people convene, how can people sort of participate, which is much different maybe than previous. So it's both sort of bottom up and top down, and I think in that sense, the idea of collaboration, the idea of open-ended structure. So in the beginning, we saw also PS1, the Young Architects program we did. It's this idea of creating systems in which people can enter and actually create sort of their own narratives, very much like, you know, the online world. So that's certainly something, and sort of the solid, well, so the objectives speak about the idea that we don't just want to make buildings, but these buildings need to have ideas behind them. And the solid speaks about solidifying and sort of materializing and turning into sort of material these ideas. So that's where yeah, the name comes from.
I would say that there is also certain ambiguities in that name that we've always somehow are attracted to from the beginning. Just the ambiguity of readings of a word. Soil obviously has its own aura. It represents its own materialities as this very earthy material. But on the other hand, you can also embed ideas and agenda in there. And Idenburg Liu is the IL, so there's a person embedded in there, and sometimes you can see the person behind it, sometimes it's just the ideas, and that's enabled and facilitated where people just becomes conduit for that. So I think that this is kind of idea of multiple reading, and you know, you're able to see something at different distances and read it differently is something that we've always been interested in. And in our architecture, we also explore that ambiguity quite a bit.
And it ties a little bit into the idea of multiculturalism, or bringing many cultures together, in a sense that sometimes things are misunderstood, right? And so between different cultures, there can be misunderstandings, and there is not necessarily one right way. So we're very interested in creating objects, forms, projects that can have multiple readings without one being more correct than the other. So we're very interested in creating in that sense, a language that is sort of, you know, that can be understood by many different people from many different backgrounds, and can be interpreted in sort of many ways without one, you know, being better than the other, so to say.
There also, though, does seem to be a very formal interest in the practice, which has to do with structure. And it just comes to mind because we're looking at this exhibition that you had and this particular display on the Spiky project from 2013. And it seems to me that one thing that comes up in your work a lot, and we'll see more images of this, is the way that you create space through these rather light and ingenious ways of disposing a small amount of material in a fairly capacious way. And I wonder if you could talk about that formal interest and how you see it as part of the kind of DNA of the practice.
Maybe it ties back to, again, the also starting in 2008 and being very smart with materials. And for instance, we looked earlier also at Freeze, the tent we, you know, helped bring to London, from London to New York. But it is, how can you in some way create an in-between zone, or expand a zone between the interior, between the private and between the public realm. And we do that in a way by creating sort of this light, ambiguous zone in a way which is more ephemeral, which is not private, not public, not interior, not exterior. And this is exactly the zone where we believe people can come together and meet. And so this is often very ephemeral. And indeed, we try to often with materials, try to find a way to infuse it with as much sort of air and porosity and openness, so that you in some way can be invited in. For instance, the project you see here is a model of an installation we recently did in Columbus, Indiana. And it is actually a hedge for the Miller House. People maybe know the Saarinen designed Miller House. This exhibition is a temporary exhibition that builds on the legacy of the Millers and their sort of commitment to modernist design. We learned that the hedge was dying and needed to be replaced. And where in the Miller House, Dan Kiley designed the garden, he used the hedge as a boundary between the private and the public. In this case, we thought, well, if they're going to replace this hedge, why don't we use the what's the name of the plant again? The plants. And so momentarily, people could enter this hedge and be in the hedge, so to say. And currently, so now the exhibition is over, and now it's actually planted into the hedge of this Dan Kiley garden. But it shows, for instance, how can we use material in and create sort of a new experience with it. I think it's a good illustration.
So
I
that's
would say that it's fair that we've always been suspicious of this long-held concept that architecture can be permanent and can be singular in um, its occupation on Earth. Nothing is permanent, right? Like everything evolves and everything changes, and we kind of have to recommit ourselves. Like I think that the Ise Shrine is a very good example that every 20 years you have to kind of recommit to a tradition or recommit to that structure itself. And maybe we don't have to do it every 20 years. Sometimes it's shorter and sometimes it's longer. But this idea that it's an interaction between the human and the other forms of life or objects and life of objects, that it's that relationship we're trying to kind of surface in our work, and rather than making this very static, permanent, singular object.
Yeah, it seems also that, and this is a good image, perhaps to mention this, that transparency seems like an important principle in the work also. And I wonder whether that might be associated with that idea of ephemerality, like you could literally see through the building and it gives it this sense of fragility or ephemerality, just in a visual, it's like a visual cue to that kind of ephemerality, perhaps. And it comes up a lot with that idea.
But I think there is obviously an idea of transparency that is part of high modernism, which suggests some sort of universal connected world. And I think we're more interested in various, degrees of opacity and transparency, and sort of calibrating the sort of porosity of those layers. So we don't necessarily believe that there's one sort of, modernist world that can be all connected, which I think is the way transparency was envisioned very much sort of within the tradition of architecture as it sort of evolved. And so we are more interested in calibrating different levels of porosity to acknowledge also that, there are sort of realms, there are, groups, there are, clans in a certain way, and how to bring those together rather than thinking there's one sort of universal human that is, all the same. And I think that's a subtle difference, but I think that's where we're not interested in the sort of conventional, say, modernist idea of transparency.
That is super interesting, because if you think of modernism as having, at least in some forms of modernism, presented itself as this one size fits all universalist truth machine, and then postmodernism as this radical questioning of even the possibility of truth, and instead getting involved in this kind of endless succession of images, perhaps, and signs. It seems like what you're doing with these issues of visuality, opacity, and transparency is trying to show that there are places to stand, but they're contingent and they move and they're all relative to one another. So it's not like a kind of radical undermining of the architectural project as you might have had in some versions of postmodernism. It is inhabitable, but it does have that kind of internal shifting quality to it.
Yeah.
And I feel like sorry, go ahead, Jing.
No, maybe I was just thinking of going back to your earlier question about structure. I think what maybe departs a little bit in our work from the, let's say, high postmodernism is that we're also not interested solely in the representation of the more complex ideas.
Right.
I think we're more interested in actually producing space and structures and objects that calibrates that relationship so that you become more intentionally interacting and occupying and inhabiting this space. And if that's the intention, and the more we worked on the architectural project, you realize that you do have to innovate on the structure itself, because a lot of the structural schemes that we know and we inherit as architecture, is still very much from the modernist tradition. And they are made, even the practice of engineering, structural engineering itself is made by reducing contingencies and risks. Yeah. So it's all about driving for universal stabilities and driving for efficiencies to the maximum, degree. So this idea of being more intelligent and be able to accept the different degrees of fragilities and resilience is something that we've been really interested in work on as an architect, and not just the idea that things are more complex. Is more about being more intelligent and being able to create spaces and structures that are more calibrated and complex.
Right. Okay. That is all super relevant, of course, to the building that we're looking at now, which is, I think, one of your largest projects, certainly here in North America, which is the Shrum Museum at the University of California in Davis. Unfortunately, I have not been to the campus, so I haven't seen this in person, but it's such a compelling building even to see in images. And I wonder if we could just spend a moment talking about this specific project as a kind of example of some of the principles we've been talking about.
Yeah, and it's currently covered under, yeah, no, sorry, we literally only have one image in there, but I'll try to be very clear.
Eloquent, yes.
And currently, I should say it's covered under a smoke of the fire cloud, basically. So it's far enough, but it's interesting what is happening there, and it's very shocking what is happening there. And in some way, this project also tries to talk about that in a certain way. So it's at the University of California, Davis, which is their agricultural school. And the question here was how to introduce the arts to an audience that is not normally engaged with the arts necessarily. It's not part of the main sort of curriculum. It's not why students come to this campus specifically, because their focus of Davis is on the agricultural programs. It used to be the farm, actually, of the University of California at Berkeley, and then it became its own campus only a couple of decades ago. And so the idea was how to introduce the arts to an audience that is not normally or automatically necessarily engaged with the arts. A lot of first generation college-going families come here. And so the challenge was really, how do we not create sort of a very close sort of Apollonian temple, if you want, for the arts, and put the arts, you know, on a very high pedestal, but how do we make a way in which the students can really participate in creating the narrative around the arts? Interestingly enough, Davis is also known as a very progressive university. I think the Occupy movement actually started there. The famous pepper spray incident was there back in the days. And so we knew that we cannot bring the arts as sort of a top-down project and say this is art. It was really, it's a teaching museum. It's a museum where actually students can also participate in exhibition making, where they can, you know, participate in storytelling. And so how do we create something that's very open, that in some ways a continuity of the campus. And so what we really wanted to do is the campus is sort of a very beautifully landscaped site, just a little bit south of Sacramento. So we thought we continue the campus, and we just create this very open, very porous cover, a grand canopy, we called it. Also to make the environment itself part of the experience. Since, you know, in the Central Valley, drought, climate, you know, it can get very hot. We wanted to sort of make this environmental aspect also part of the museum experience. And so by creating this sort of very loose veil that basically covers the entirety of the site, you create again these sort of in-between spaces that can very easily be occupied. Students come to study there. They use the walls of the museum to project on. There is this plaza, which you see here in front of the image, which is sort of an open structure, if you want, where people can, you know, create, artists can work in, and that is again that sort of in-between zone. And then in the white, you see the three sort of pavilions. One is for the arts on the right. Those are really the gallery spaces. The one in the far left is operation, and it's basically for the staff. And then up front is a classroom and lecture hall. And in between there's courtyards and a lobby. So it's a very porous and open structure. Actually, landscape and gallery sort of merge. And yeah, they offer the student many different spaces that they can freely interpret for use.
Yeah, when you were saying the campus is beautifully landscaped, I was thinking you could say the same of the building. So it has this quality of kind of rolling hills. And as we go to some of these other projects, we'll see that relational quality, the way that you're kind of using program as a way to articulate the space, is another consistency through some of the projects.
Yeah, and sort of porosity, and I wanted to show this project as it's currently finishing up, actually in East Williamsburg or Bushwick. It's an arts campus. It's a residency program, but there's also artist studios and a performance space, and there will be sort of a small coffee bookshop and what have you. But I think here again, the sort of integration of the gallery and the landscape is very important. And so we try to pull the most public programs deep into the block itself. And so actually the sort of court, it's more like a Berlin model, if you want, where you go from, you know, the street into a sort of an in-between space and then into the space itself. So I think the integration of these sort of interior spaces and exterior spaces for, you know, is something we think about a lot.
You know, this image also prompts me to ask you about materials and whether that is another, well, I assume it must be an important aspect of the practice, because I feel like there's such a strong sense of a vocabulary that you bring to your various projects. And I'm sure people have noticed that already, but I wonder if you could talk, again, as some more of these images kind of coast by, can you talk a little bit about the material selection of the studio and how you think about that aspect of the buildings?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, most of our projects were using as cheap and as light materials as possible. So a lot of them were aluminum, fabric, you know, steel pipes. And I think even at that moment, we were very keen on having the material to have a certain personalities and also to make it perform in a way that it calls attention to its craft. So even if it's a very pedestrian and very mundane objects or materials that you would easily, you know,
like a brick.
Yeah, this is something that you would easily go past without paying attention, and it's just merely the way that the hands are putting together. Someone thought about it and it will catch your attention. So kind of calling a certain attention and giving a characteristic to the material is something that we're very interested in. And as the practice evolved, we were able to expand the material palette into, you know, glass, for example. In this image you're seeing, it's 1 ton of glass, you know, flat glass that's bent into a 1 meter diameter tube, so curvature, which takes about 8 hours to bend each of this glass into that shape in a mold in the autoclave, and it's completely monitored with the utmost precise kind of environmental controlled space. So it's technically really advanced. But here you can see that there's 400 something of these glass tubes. Each is about 9 meter tall, floating literally 50 meter above the ground on the waterfront of Hong Kong. So you can see this facade from across the Victoria Harbour on the other side of Hong Kong. And this is on the Kowloon island side, peninsula side. So even though it's in this very you know, busy skyline of Hong Kong, where you've got all these materialities and all this different expressions and different architectural languages all pasted on top of each other, there's something that really stands out in that facade with this very simple and very ubiquitous materials of glass. And obviously, up and close encountering with it, it creates a certain visual distortions and acoustic qualities that also makes the experience of occupying next to it and in it very interesting for the passerbys. So I think to really make a material to perform and then giving it some unique characters and really calling attention to the craft that's gone into working with it is something that we've been always interested in, no matter what kind of material that we used from the beginning.
And maybe the next image is nice because it shows a little bit also how we were talking about transparency. And, you know, this is not glass that is trying to disappear, right? As Jing is saying, this is where suddenly the material itself calls a little bit of attention, you know, to it, and it has a presence. So often, I think architects use material to create larger surfaces in a way. But for us, actually, the unit or the element itself is the thing that we use to create this heightened experience. You can easily imagine this as a flat curtain wall, like an Apple Store, for instance, and then there is no glass, right? The idea is that glass isn't there. But I think the way we work with this material is more saying, hey, here's glass, this is glass. and so you become aware of it, and so there is a real tactility to it.
Yeah, It also is a great example of something Jing said earlier, which is that sometimes you have to innovate the structure in order to produce the meaning and the kind of experiential dimension of the building. And this is a great example of that. But there's also a really great contrast that we can draw here between this building, which is kind of, it feels to me kind of Rolls-Royce-y. You know, it's very high spec, let's put it that way. And then this fantastic project, which is public housing, which has a much more vernacular material feel, and of course a totally different program as well. So can you tell us about taking this other recent project on?
Well, so that's, I think, not only are we very interested in bringing, different cultures together, we also don't want to sort of operate exclusively in a certain economic realm, if you know what I mean. So often, architects, they serve a certain community. For us, we feel that we are very interested in working with anybody around the world who's interested in progressive and innovative ideas. And so this project is a social housing project in León, in Mexico. It's about a 3-hour north drive of Mexico City. It's a very rapidly urbanizing city because a lot of the car industry is there. And so a lot of migrant workers move to this city, but they end up building informal housing at the perimeter of the city itself. And so the housing authority and the mayor asked us to come and work with them on figuring out a way to build for this group of people, but built inside the city itself. So that they have more access to jobs, they have more access to infrastructure, because with this very rapidly low dense expanding city, it's really hard for the city to keep the city safe, to provide education, trash pickup, and what have you. And so this is a prototype where we had to provide 60 units for a very, very tight budget, $2 million construction. And so what we did there is actually, we needed to not use too much heavy equipment. So initially we wanted to have precast concrete panels, but that would mean we would have to drive a truck 3 hours away. We would need a crane to install. And so basically all the cost would go into the machinery, basically. And so they said if we would work towards reducing this size to a block that one person can carry, which is 17 kilo, then many more people could be involved in creating the project. And so actually the money wouldn't go to the one person with the crane, but it would actually go to many more workers. And so we developed this custom concrete block with a local cement factory. And it actually allows to create the same effect we were looking for in the precast panels, but actually by hand stacking them. And so what you see here is this facade, which in many ways, mimics or does something similar to the project in Hong Kong, where actually the material unit itself is the thing that produces its effect. And here it's assembled, by hand, by the local community.
Yeah, it's
so.
There's two types.
There are two types, but it basically you can see that the blocks has a different faces. So by the rotation of them, you can create many, many more different orientations and patterns.
Yeah.
So it looks much more varied than the types that's being used. It's only 2 types of bricks.
Yeah. I just love the idea too that there's a formal structural solution here that's actually driven by, I might even use the word political, but certainly a social awareness of how you want the money from the project to flow into the hands of the people who are building it, and avoiding a kind of top-down pyramid structure where it's the capital owner that makes the money, and making sure that there's a kind of proliferation of that resource, which of course is exactly in tune with the program of the building. So it's all very
it was a very meaningful project for us to work on now. And these were images we recently, Iwan Ban, our friend photographer, he just passed by and he took some shots. So we're really excited about seeing the process, because there's no budget for us to actually go and visit the construction site. So.
Right. When does the building open, and when will it have residents?
We're 4 months away from opening. It's very, if you go to the next slide, you can see it's very light at the interiors of the units, but it's very simple and humble units. And actually the outside wall is also the inside wall. So this is actually the finished wall in the interior. We do assume that, people who will be occupying it will paint it and will come up with, any type of use. So I think it's going to be a very vibrant building that certainly will change over time.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see how your sort of quasi-modular architecture gets customized.
Yeah.
Well, that's a fantastic project. So congratulations on that. It's a super inspiring one. We also have a couple of things closer to home. So this project also, I think, currently in progress in Brooklyn. Is that right?
Yeah, this is currently under construction. It's a residential community near the Gowanus. And I think what is interesting is, again, some of these lessons that we learn in one project, they come to the other. Here, what was very important for us is the circulation system, which we also have actually in the Leon project, which is how can you, in an apartment in your home, have light from as many different directions as possible. And so here we kept all the circulation to the exterior through sort of a courtyard, which is open. And so people get to their home through this courtyard up, in an elevator, but then through an exterior walkway to their house. And it means that every apartment is really sort of a home, if you want, with light from 3 or 4 sides, which is very rare in New York. So this is currently under construction. It's actually our first commercial residential project here in the city. So we're very excited about it, and we work with a young group of very progressive and adventurous thinkers, because real estate in the city is so formulaic, and it's so like locked into certain rules, and certainly exterior circulation is a quite radical proposition there.
Yeah, now that the entire world has gotten to experience the personality of a New York real estate developer.
Yeah.
I have to say that your ability to navigate that register of architectural practice is also very impressive. That you're able
yeah, we will see, but we're really excited about this team, and we're actually working with them on another project as well. So for us, I think they're also interested in new typologies and new ways of finding how to live together. So here you see the courtyard and exterior circulation piece, which is really a very light-filled, very open space where, in other places this would be a double-loaded corridor, basically. And here you see the block as well. So we're actually working here with a Turkish block manufacturer on a custom block. So that this is the mock-up for the facade of that building.
Well, it looks almost like a terrazzo.
Yeah, it's very beautiful. It's very interesting. So it's really nice that we can also, we find new ways to develop new materials with manufacturers in many different places in the world. Yeah.
So one last architectural project, and what we're doing here towards the end of the talk, just so the audience is aware, we're now kind of zooming in to a smaller scale. So we'll be getting to a seating project in a moment. But first we have this gorgeous house in Long Island to look at. So here we're at the scale of a single family residence. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, tell us about this. I think this will be our last architectural project.
Right. It's actually also our first realized residential or single family private homes ever, which also took a very long time to realize. The owners are friends of ours, and they're extremely particular and very evolved in their taste as well. So it's been a long journey to kind of find the right thing to build together. And I think this represents basically our take on the barn. They were very enamored. It's on the Long Island, and so the vernacular of the barn is very important to them. And I think we basically took this very simple partie, that it's a family of 4, 5. Well, when we started designing, it was 4 people, and then they added one more member during the design. So we had to add a few more rooms. But now it's a family of 5. So the program is quite simple. It's what you see like on the left lower side is the living room, and the right side.
No, this is the living room. This is the bedroom.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So returning the right and lower right is the living room, and the kitchen. Not the kitchen is the
top right.
Top right. Yeah. Sorry, I have a hard time with left and right. And the top left is the bedroom, and also the bottom left is also the bedroom. And in the middle is the dining room. So it's a very simple party. It's basically two barns that intersect with each other. And so from all sides, you're just looking at pretty much a vernacular barn. But there are certain moments where the two roofs gets curved and melted together, or at the entry and in the kind of top area, you can see there's a slight lift to come out and then rotate to welcome the visitors in. And then also hidden in the middle of the barn, the two barns, is this flat roof that also becomes a terrace that you can enter from the guest rooms. And the other typologies that was very interesting to them is this idea of the porch. But we said that rather than having the porch to be so directly associated with certain programs, like the sitting room or the kitchen, what about thinking about the porch more as this architectural devices that stays with you everywhere in the house. So it's more like the idea of the engawa in Japanese houses, where you have this space between the interior of the building and the exterior, the context, the gardens. There's that in-between space that's covered, and it's the extension of the architectural surfaces, but it's also the surface that welcomes and mediates between the interior and the garden itself. And this engawa space actually runs through the entire house, even on the interior. So this view, you can see that the engawa, or the porch, the narrow porch, basically goes right into the middle of the space, and it crosses in this shape, and then it brings the daylight into the middle of the house as well. So in the middle of the house, where the seating area is, you have a skylight all around you on four sides. So it's a very simple party, but at every moment of the house, they come together in a different way and produce different effects. So at the corner, they produce this open, transparent corner, which is structurally very difficult to achieve, and it's not really a barn structurally at the end of the day. And you can see also maybe in that open corner the skylight on the edge, and then so over the seating area you have this floating Venetian plaster ceiling that brings the light kind of shimmering above you. And the materiality, a lot of it is wood, and a lot of it's the standing seam roofing. So something that's quite usually used, but again, applied with certain crafts and also slightly different attention to themselves than what you would typically see.
And is this building already complete and being lived in, or is it just?
Yes.
It's been lived in for 2 years by now. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's certainly a weekend retreat, but they have lived there as well since March, and I think just came back yesterday or today.
Yeah, we can all identify. Well, in some ways we can, in some ways we can't. But we can identify with the reason of wanting to be out on Long Island, that's for sure. It's a fantastic project because on a certain level it's so simple. As you said, the partie is very kind of clear and almost orthogonal in its conception, and then there's all of the subtlety. I particularly love that that other kind of porosity that you were describing, the Japanese engawa principle being applied to the perimeter of the structure. Well, let's now turn our attention to the just a few more interior shots.
This is, for instance, the fireplace, which is this sort of brutalist, concrete. But it's very nice because it's also a very gentle divider between the sitting room and the dining room, and so the fire can actually, be seen from both ends. Yeah.
That's an amazing seating object as well. I guess that's not yours though. That straw thing.
No.
But
we actually worked together with Andre Herrero and Adam Charlotte.
Oh, Adam Charlotte. Yeah, Charlotte. Yeah.
Yeah. And they did some of the interiors. For instance, also this screening room is done by them. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, well let's talk about Frame. This will be our last topic, and this is a collaboration that you have had with Friedman Benda Gallery, just to mention that. So here we're at a still smaller scale, the scale of seating, but still talking about a lot of the issues that we have been referring to do with transparency and opacity, layering, of visuality, and then the creation of space structures, obviously. So can you talk a little bit about this project and also your interest in taking on the idea of a seating design?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of things that come together, and that's why we enjoyed finishing with this project, because I think a lot of the things we spoke about actually they operate on many different scales, and it's quite nice to see how they, how they work in different scales. But so we were first of all interested in some. So this seating is something that works both exterior and interior. So it's a stainless steel structure that can be both used for interior seating at a gallery, for instance, or it can be used at the exterior. And then it brings two of these concepts that we spoke about together. One is the sort of ambiguous form. So it's not really clear how you can use it. It certainly, so it requests participation. It requests a sort of thinking from the user. It's like, can I sit here or not? How do I deal with that? So it's this structural element that gets draped with this chain link mesh. It's very similar mesh to the one we used at the Kupche Gallery in Seoul. It's actually the same team we're working with fabricating this. This are all hand welded rings. They're all hand welded together. And now we have a relationship with this place in China for about 10 years, I guess. And so they make this mesh, which then drapes over this structure. And then it asks the visitor, can I sit here, can I sit there? It's always for more than one person. And as you sit, the mesh adjusts a little bit. So if you're sitting there and somebody else sits, it adjusts a little bit. And so this idea that you become aware of the other, again, is very much part of this as well. So it is something that asks for interpretation, and it is something that heightens your relationship with the people around you. And so this is exciting. It was part of an exhibition at Friedman Benda. This is the first one we did. And then we continue to develop more of these. I realize we have a low resolution image here, but basically it's sort of a family of sorts, if you want. So with this, we developed a language, and we just finished the 5th one. So this is the 3rd one. They're all unique pieces. They're all sort of one-offs. And so we actually fabricate the frames here in Brooklyn, and drape it and then trim it. So, but they all have a different scale and a different capacity. This is the 3rd, and then there's the 4th, I think here, which is a little bit taller. And we just finished the 5th one. I don't think we have finished pictures of them yet, but earlier on you saw the pictures of that fabrication. And so I think, yeah, it's very much, it's in some way the essence of the things that we spoke about come together in this family of sorts.
I'm also very taken with the idea that they're kind of social microcosms, like that idea that's almost like a contoured seesaw, where if you sit here, then somebody else will feel it there. And yeah, because each of them has this quality of being like a miniature landscape, they almost seem like tiny little models of society itself. I really love that idea of like containing that kind of interactivity in the object.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we were very excited about this project, and so we're excited about working with Friedman on that.
Yeah. The materiality of it is also very interesting because, of course, you think of metal furniture, and in fact, you think of architect-designed metal furniture as being this extremely kind of rigorous, Marcel Breuer, Mies van der Rohe, this kind of perfectible form that is attached to it. And here you're using what is essentially tubular metal, and then this almost armor-like material of chain link, chainmail. Produce such a kind of flexible and inviting object.
It's interesting because people are really surprised how comfortable it is and how soft it actually is. Yeah. And the first time we encountered chainmail, because it's used on a smaller scale for like butcher gloves and like belly dancing attire, and it's amazing when you hold it in your hands. It's very soft for a metal mesh because of the round rings basically, and because of the way they knit together. And I think that's the surprising thing when people sit down, they think it's going to be very uncomfortable, but actually it is very comfortable. And it certainly is a riff a little bit on the sort of bent frame, the tube, the Breuer seating, right? It is like the bent tube as a structure, but in this case, it's one that is more chaotic and more complex rather than the clear modernist line, so to say.
Yeah. Well,
so like the medieval armor material,
sure.
right? Like we actually got our inspiration for the Kucha gallery on a visit to the Met when we were with our kids and looking at the medieval armors. And we knew that we wanted to make something double curved on the architectural scale, and we knew that we didn't want to just rely on computational, tools to facet it and pleat it and modulate it. So we're like, okay, how can we make a building that's double curved in one piece? And then we looked at the medieval armor, which is this very defensive object, and actually to be able to make it in a way that is more sensuous and much more inviting, and something that you can, you can enjoy. It's very nice.
That's like every curator's dream to hear a story like that.
Yeah.
The armor and have this come out the other end.
Yes. Luckily, the museums are open again.
Yeah. The Met just reopened, didn't it? Yeah. So people can go and see the armor again. Well, we have a couple of questions to ask. And thanks for that incredible tour of so many different projects of so many different types. So John Prown asked a question about materials, but it's particularly about question the budget as it meets materials. So are there particular engineering challenges to make lower cost materials achieve the safety and strength requirements that you need? So how do you balance that out?
So that's obviously per project very specific. So for instance, the Mexico project, the budget was extremely constrained. And so meaning we always need to figure out what is there's always budget limitations, no matter even, the crazy ones we looked at, you're always working against a budget and find a way to sort of optimize or find the sweet spot. I would say, for instance, the gallery or the museum, the Shrem Museum is a good example in Davis. There is the primary steel structure, which is actually the structure that holds up the rest of the roof. Funnily enough, coincidentally, we have a section lying here of this beam, which is the infill. And so normally you would have secondary steel and a metal panel hanging there. And so the idea here is to collapse the two. So structurally, this is the beam that can span 30 feet, but it's also the mesh, so to say, itself that shifts the thing. And I think so thinking through, there's not a universal answer to this question. There's more sort of a thinking of like, okay, what can we do best with the budget is there to in some way get the most, say, mileage out of a material. And really it can be for very, very constrained budgets to the one at in Hong Kong, which was certainly an expensive facade.
But I would say that we also learned over time that as just practicing for ourselves and for other people that if we try to like silo each element of the building and only solve the problem within that silo, then typically you don't get to the innovative and the most interesting solutions. So in this case, for example, to reduce the secondary beam and the infill and collapsing it into one element, where they're able to actually produce a better element to solve both problems at once. And that is I would say like a skill or a knowledge that we gained over time, and try to think more kind of across, break through the silos and think on the kind of more holistic way, that what is the final optimal and desired outcome, and let's not solve things in their own bucket.
Yeah.
Right. Let me ask you just one last question, because we're just about up to our time, but it's a question I just got by text, and it's about the relationship between digital rendering and the physical buildings, because the comment is that the buildings sometimes look a lot like renderings or have a kind of digital language to them. And I realize that, of course, we've showed some renderings as well as some photographs of buildings. And I guess it's a broader question about how digital aesthetics does or does not influence the aesthetics of the structures you're creating.
I don't think we showed a single render.
No, it's just that the image culture these days of photography and renderings are blurring.
No, sorry.
It can be quite hard to tell, right?
We did show a render. It was the Warren project.
Sorry. Shoe.
No, we're not interested in building the render. I think for us, what is very interesting is actually the bodily experience in the space. So we're very interested in the the tectonics, the material, and so even when we did our first installation at PS1 at MoMA, some people said based on the image, it's a very beautiful project, and I said you cannot know because you didn't go there, and it is something that you need to experience. And I think for us, architecture is built and is experienced. Obviously, we very much appreciate the whole history and the culture of paper architecture, and there is a lot of that there. But for us, and that maybe goes back to the idea of solid objectives as well, we want to solidify, we want to make material those ideas. And so the image only can go so far, and it really has to do with the material assembly.
Yeah, I would even maybe say, just from my own perspective, that you're using materials that seem very digital friendly, like glass, for example. And as you said, Florian, earlier in the comparison that you made to the Apple Store, you're using some materials that we very much associate with this 21st century digital aesthetic culture that we all inhabit together, like our phones,
Yeah.
But you're using those materials in a totally different way that gives a different vantage point and a different kind of somatic or perceptual experience of them. So that seems like a very important aspect of the practice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there, guys. Thank you so much for this whirlwind tour of your brains. It's been amazing.
Yeah.
Wishing you all the very best with all these ongoing projects, and also, of course, everyone in your studio. I know they're far flung across the globe at the moment, but thanks to them as well, vicariously. I did want to announce that, of course, we have another Design and Dialogue coming up on Friday with my co-host Stephen Burks, and he's going to be talking to Carla Fernandez and Pedro Reyes, in fact, from Mexico City. So please come back to hear about their house, which is amazing, and then the other creative things they get up to down there. And Florian and Jing, it's been so great to have you here on Design and Dialogue. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Glenn.
Okay.